of this section with Professor Ken Keithley. We're one of the oldest in the society. We started in 1995. Craig Blazing, Stan Gruntz, and I. We've invited a lot of speakers, way further out than our beloved brother Dale Allison. And we want to jump right in. I think there's a lot of reason why we should be rather acutely interested in this topic, the way this topic is being currently discussed. Welcoming on the resurrection of Jesus, framing done by Dale C. Allison Jr.'s important recent contribution to the field. The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, and History, from Clark Bloomsbury 2021. This volume has become a touchstone in contemporary resurrection studies because it reframes the question of evidence with unusual candor and analytic precision. Allison is both a believer in the bodily resurrection of Jesus and a historian deeply committed to the rules of evidence, and his work invites us to think carefully about what historians may and may not responsibly claim. Today we have 4 colleagues whose perspectives represent the strongest contemporary approaches to defending, analyzing, or expanding the evidentiary case for the resurrection. Gary Habermas, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're pronouncing that name, from Liberty University, very well known to all of us, whose quote-unquote minimal facts approach seeks to ground the resurrection in a core historical consensus shared across the field. Andrew Loke from Hong Kong Baptist University, also, whom we highly esteem, everyone here, whose cumulative case argument integrates philosophical reasoning with historical method. Michael Licona from Houston Christian University, also very notable publication, who applies ancient historiographical analysis to the Gospels to determine their evidential weight. And Jordan Wesley, also well published in this field, Lindsay Wilson College, who examines the doctrinal and analytic theological coherence of resurrection belief. Each of these papers explores a different dimension of Allison's take on the evidentiary landscape: historical data, philosophical justification, genre and textual reliability, and theological coherence. Dale Allison's 2021 volume stands as the intellectual center of gravity for this conversation, in my opinion. His analysis of memory, testimony, religious experience, probability, and epistemic limits raises the unavoidable question: what exactly qualifies as evidence for a unique, non-repeatable event in antiquity, let alone the resurrection in antiquity? Dale, however, is in good company with the earliest Christian reflections, as in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. No one can prove to you by demonstration that Christ rose from the dead, but we know it by the testimonies of the prophets and by the teaching of Christ, which persuades us. And also in Irenaeus' Against Heresies, he writes that the resurrection cannot be known, quote, except by faith, unquote, because Christ did not appear to all, but only to chosen witnesses. And in Contraselsum, Origen insists that the resurrection cannot be evaluated by the quote-unquote mechanics of proof demanded by skeptics. He says Celsus expects a resurrection visible to all, but such an expectation misunderstands the nature of the event. In the city of God, Augustine declares, the resurrection was not seen by those who killed him, nor by those who mocked. It was known by the witnesses whom he chose. Cyril of Alexandria, in his commentary on Luke 24, states that Christ's appearances after the resurrection were selective and intended, quote, not for unbelievers, but for the faithful, unquote. Theodorus of Cyrus, the resurrection cannot be tested by outsiders. Leo the Great, whose namesake, by the way, currently serves in Rome, a rather unique American position. Sermons on the resurrection routinely emphasizes 2 points. The resurrection is physical and real, shown by Christ eating and being touched. Yet only the disciples witnessed this, therefore the world must accept the truth through, quote, the preaching of those who saw, unquote. Leo insists that faith rests on the autoritas testium, acknowledging that no neutral observer could have verified the resurrection. This is almost Augustinian on Leo's part in its restraint. Bodily reality affirmed, evidentiary limits admitted. In terms of Dale's interlocutors, we should remind ourselves at the outset about the work of Richard Bauckham, who defends the eyewitness testimony in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, but he ultimately acknowledges memory is fallible, evidence is non-demonstrative, whatever evidence is there is non-demonstrative or demonstratable, and the resurrection is not provable in historical critical terms. He lands near Allison on epistemic limits, though with more confidence in eyewitness tradition. Dale argues that the gospel resurrection narratives do not provide what modern evidentiary argumentation typically requires, especially given the complexities of eyewitness memory and the theological shaping of early Christian tradition. At the same time, he maintains that the disciples' post-mortem experiences of Jesus were real, historically significant, even if they cannot be demonstrated with courtroom clarity. The result is not skepticism, but epistemic humility, a recognition that historical method may guide us to the threshold, but faith, reasoned, self-aware, and responsible crosses it. Today's session, therefore, stages an unusually rich exchange, the leading apologists for the historical resurrection engaging directly with the historian who has provided the clearest articulation of the methodological boundaries within which their arguments must operate. For method and systematic theology, this is the precise place where history, theology, and philosophy meet their limits and find their responsibilities. Why should we be so concerned with the evidentiary question? As a theologian committed to exegetical rigor and often amazed by the outsized influence of what is called apologetics, I am often reminded of Jesus' metaphor in the warning to his disciples. Beware of the leaven of the scribes and the Pharisees. I think the condemned leaven there is in their exegetical kitchen is the exaggerated claims of puffed up theological exposition. Exaggerated claims do that. We have a lot of leaven in Christian orthodoxy of our own. Perhaps this will be a paradigm for helping us to make better selections about our ingredients for theology in the future. So we will begin, first of all, with our first named speaker, Michael Licona, and
afternoon. 20 years ago, I picked up Dale Allison's book, Resurrecting Jesus, and reserved reading it for a long flight to Hawaii. After boarding, I stowed my carry-on, got settled, opened the book, and began reading. Now, sitting next to me was an elderly couple, must have been in their 80s. Before we even exchanged a word, the man leaned over, grabbed the left side of my book, turned it to look at the title, and then said, "Ha! Now that we know that Jesus never existed, the resurrection is a non-issue." And he turned and looked forward. Well, I thought, that's not the end of this conversation. So I asked why he believed Jesus never existed. I shared some historical evidence for Jesus and pointed out that very few scholars, just a fringe minority, deny that he was a real person. He quickly shifted his stance. Well, even if Jesus did exist, his resurrection is a different issue entirely. I agreed, and that opened the door for me to lay out a few reasons why I think a very good case can be made that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, if you're wondering how the rest of our conversation went, I'm happy to inform you that by the time we landed, I had finished reading a significant amount of Dale's book. Leap ahead 16 years, and Dale gives us a fresh monograph on the resurrection. It's both an affirmation and a challenge to the belief. I've long valued his scholarship. His authenticity and intellectual candor are scarce in the academy, and his openness influenced my own doctoral research and still colors my thinking today. Moreover, Dale poses important questions that had never crossed my mind during my own investigation. Yet I confess that certain pages of this new volume leave me uneasy. I struggle to see how some of what he discusses squares with an Orthodox Christian worldview. And on several points, I must disagree. As examples, Dale judges the story of the guard at the tomb to be sheer fiction. He insists Matthew believed the report of saints rising at Jesus' death, which some of you will be happy to hear, but that Matthew was mistaken and that the episode itself is religious fiction, which the same lot of you will be disappointed to hear. He also doubts the historicity of the group appearances reported by Luke and John. Given time limitations, some of these matters may have to wait until my discussion with Dale tomorrow at the Sound Faith Conference located about 1 mile from here. And please forgive my shameless plug, but it's going to be a very good conference. For this paper, I will limit myself to 3 major topics we observe in Dale's monograph: the burden of proof, the nature of apparitions, and the question of agency. Number 1, burden of proof. At the very beginning, Dale says his book is an exercise in the limits of historical criticism. He argues that the Christian apologist cannot establish with some assurance or beyond a reasonable doubt that God raised Jesus from the dead, and that the skeptic is equally unable to demonstrate the contrary. So, Dale will plant his flag somewhere on the vast mainland between 2 islands of near certainty, offering only observations and provisional judgments in place of a fully assured verdict. Dale accomplishes what he set out to do. His reflections on the post-mortem appearances probe deeply and quite often persuade. Most of his tentative conclusions strike me as entirely sound. Yet at times, one senses a studied reluctance, as though each inference and refutation must clear a bar so high that only mathematical proof would suffice. For example, on page 233 he says, "How can we absolutely dismiss on historical grounds the possibility of subjective hallucinations and mass wish fulfillment?" On page 356 he writes, "I would be delighted were my more conservative friends to persuade me that they have made their case, that logical scrupulosity yields their belief, that to disagree means committing a ratiocinative blunder. I remain, however, unconverted. They have more optimism, more faith in historical reason and in our sources than I can muster. The evidence, which is not all on one side, does not demand their verdict. To be clear, we cannot absolutely rule out the mere possibility of hallucinations, nor can we insist the evidence must require historians to affirm the resurrection as if it were a Euclidean demonstration. That would set a standard of proof rarely achievable in historical inquiry. Rather, the craft of the historian is to set competing explanations side by side and choose the one that best accounts for the data, all the while keeping the door ajar for fresh data that may refine or even overturn today's verdict. In other words, a prudent historian could say the evidence justifies the conclusion that Jesus probably rose from the dead, without going so far as to assert the evidence demands the conclusion that he rose. Dale may not disagree. He reminds us that the historian's task is to determine, if possible, which solution is the right one, or at least which one best fits the evidence. Precisely. A historian may deem hypothesis X the front runner, yet hesitate to label it probable. Furthermore, Dale assesses the pro and con arguments for the empty tomb, judges they are not equal, and concludes Jesus was probably laid in a tomb which some women later found empty. So I find myself confused on those other occasions previously mentioned when he appears to raise the bar far beyond standard historical practice. Dale might reply that I'm not understanding him correctly, and that he's simply addressing apologists and scholars who insist the evidence meets and exceeds what is demanded by such a high burden of proof. Perhaps I'm mistaken. I hope that's the case. Even so, who exactly are these people Dale is addressing? He offers 7 names at the beginning of chapter 18, one writing in the 17th century, 2 in the 18th, 3 in the 19th, and 1 in the early 20th. Apart from perhaps 1 or 2 contemporary exceptions of which I'm aware, I know of no serious scholar or apologist today who claims the data demands belief in the resurrection or renders every naturalistic alternative impossible. The very small number of outliers are hardly representative. To treat them as though they are verges on shooting at a straw man. The pattern repeats on page 234, where Dale replies to skeptics who say the resurrection has been absolutely disproved. He observes, quite rightly, that they cannot establish without doubt the illusory character of the early Christian experiences. Yet who are these skeptics making such a sweeping claim? Perhaps I'm mistaken, but it seems to me that Dale is here sparring with a tiny and unrepresentative fringe. Turn to page 358, and you'll find Dale reminding us that our evidence comes in fragments, perhaps 30 pieces, puzzle pieces out of 100 regarding the events after Jesus' death. The 70 missing pieces he muses might include the private diary of Peter or James that would radically change our understanding of their experiences of Jesus after his death, or even a hospital report penned by Joseph of Arimathea. He's quite right. Such gaps haunt every corner of historical research. Yet the imagination needn't stop there, for we could just as well picture ourselves as brains floating in vats, entertained by a mischievous neuroscientist, or envisage a universe spoken into existence 5 minutes ago, complete with ready-made memories. And I guess, Jonathan, we would not have eaten that wonderful pizza just a few minutes ago. Press that line of thought far enough, and history itself evaporates. Of course, we cannot absolutely refute those scenarios, but we rightly set them aside, for the evidential support for each is precisely the same as for Peter's hypothetical diary: none. Historians proceed by asking which explanation best accounts for the data we do possess, and by embracing, however provisionally, the one that emerges as most probable. Seen in this light, Dale's caution, valuable as it often is, sometimes overshoots the mark, in my opinion. In pushing back against overconfidence, he appears at points to have embraced its mirror image, an overcaution that risks paralyzing judgment just where responsible inference is both possible and justified. Number 2, apparitions. Chapter 9 is where things get especially intriguing. Dale examines the phenomenon of apparitions of the dead. He points to a wealth of literature showing that many people report experiencing the presence of a deceased loved one. In fact, over half of widows and widowers say they've had such experiences. My dad was one such person. Within a year of my mom's death, he told me he awoke sometime during the previous night and saw my mom sitting in a chair near him. She was smiling, luminescent, and beautiful. Apparitions can occur individually or in groups, sometimes involve physical death and even include speech. At first glance, these might seem to undercut the uniqueness of Jesus' post-mortem appearances. But Dale acknowledges key differences. He writes, "I know of no close phenomenological parallel to the series of likely events as a whole. Early Christianity offers us a missing body, plus visions to several individuals, plus collective apparitions, plus the sense of a dead man's presence, plus the conversion vision of at least one hostile outsider. Taken as a whole, this is, on any account, a remarkable, even extraordinary confluence of events and claims. If there is a good, substantial parallel to the entire series, I have yet to run across it." The research of Jonathan Kendall reaches the same verdict in his recent book, Seeing the Messiah, which explores 150 years of psychical research on apparitions. Kendall observes that most apparitions do not talk, and if they do, it is usually one short phrase or sentence, and the communication often is done telepathically. In certain rare cases, apparitions will engage in protracted conversations with percipients. He goes on to say that in order to replicate the pattern we see in the Gospels and 1 Corinthians 15, you have to combine elements from numerous exceptional cases. He calls it a montage of apparitions' greatest hits. He writes, "The sheer number, magnitude, and effects of Jesus' multiple appearances can rightfully be deemed impressive evidence against reducing them to apparitional phenomena." By the way, Jonathan's book is excellent. He's here. Jonathan, raise your hand. It's an excellent book, and anyone who's interested in resurrection studies, it's a must-read.
Thanks, Mark.
To be clear, Dale does not think apparitions are the Rosetta Stone for understanding the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. However, he does think they're worth exploring. He calls them heuristically profitable, and asks what light they might shine on the resurrection narratives. How are they heuristically profitable? Near the end of chapter 9, he writes, "Those of us who believe that some apparitional encounters are not wholly subjective will be more inclined than others to entertain a non-hallucinatory genesis for the appearances of Jesus." In other words, if reality includes a spiritual dimension in which the dead still live and sometimes appear to others, then the post-mortem appearances of Jesus are not so difficult a pill to swallow. And that's a helpful observation. Number 3, agency. Finally, we come to what Dale says is the most challenging issue by far on which his book touches: agency. What caused the disciples to believe Jesus was still alive in a supernatural sense? Dale answers that this question holds its proud place as the prized puzzle of New Testament research. Determining the cause of an event, religious or otherwise, is often a difficult task for historians. Even well-documented moments can defy clear explanation. Consider the mysterious 1886 deaths of King Ludwig II of Bavaria and his physician. Did they drown by accident, or were they murdered? The truth remains elusive. On a much broader scale, take the collapse of the Bronze Age, a sudden and far-reaching breakdown of several major civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East during the early 12th century BC. This brought the late Bronze Age to an abrupt close and ushered in centuries of decline, instability, and cultural regression, often referred to as the Greek Dark Ages. Scholars have proposed many theories, but the precise cause of the collapse remains shrouded in mystery. Even so, in both instances, historians acknowledge the occurrence of the events while leaving their cause undetermined. When we consider the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, historians do not have tools capable of confirming God is the agent who raised him. As Dale frankly observes, trying to obtain a theological proposition from history is like trying to get mind from matter. God raised Jesus from the dead is a frame-specific Christian doctrine, not a historical critical conclusion. He's right. History can take us only so far. The same can be said of science. Imagine, if you will, a comet striking the moon and scripting in the lunar dust in Hebrew and Greek the words, "Jesus is Lord." A rational onlooker might well infer divine handwriting. Yet, using the tools of astronomy, no astronomer could confirm God is the agent responsible for the event. She would acknowledge the phenomenon and leave its ultimate cause an open matter. Likewise, the historian may judge that Jesus was crucified, died, was buried, and was later alive and seen by others. Even so, the underlying cause would remain undetermined because confirming divine agency requires tools the historian does not possess. That said, apologists are free to employ broader forms of reasoning than historical methodology permits and infer divine agency once the historical ground is laid. For instance, they can consider the following 5 reasonably to strongly evidenced historical items. Number 1, Jesus implicitly claimed divinity through his words and acts. 2, he performed deeds interpreted by many as miracles. 3, he predicted his own death and resurrection. 4, his followers and at least one non-believer experienced what they took to be his bodily return to life. And 5, his tomb was empty a few days after his burial. Taken together, these furnish a cumulative case from which inferring divine agency for the appearances of Jesus is not merely reasonable, but given what we know of Jesus' life and teachings, it's arguably superior to its rivals in its explanatory scope, power, and is less ad hoc, even if the historian, as historian, cannot verify it. I think Dale would still object that one's worldview and doctrinal interests strongly influence this judgment. He writes, while God raised Jesus from the dead may cancel some options, atheism for instance, it leaves many others open. Indeed, the inexplicable disappearance of Jesus' body and his post-mortem appearances do not, in and of themselves, even tell us what religion we should adopt. Some Buddhists explain what happened to Jesus in terms of their tradition. The same holds for some Hindus. I enter my protest and counter that the Christian view enjoys an important advantage. Explaining Jesus' empty tomb and post-mortem appearances using Buddhist or Hindu categories is one thing. being one of Jesus' disciples who lived through that event after being told by Jesus it would happen is something else entirely. Dale himself acknowledges that Jesus predicted his own resurrection. So when Jesus' followers claimed to see him alive again, they were not importing foreign categories. They were making sense of their experience within a framework Jesus had already set for them. That gives their interpretation a distinct evidential advantage because it draws on first-hand experience, close proximity to the events, and is in continuity with the life and teachings of the person at the center of it all. In contrast, Buddhist and Hindu explanations of enlightenment, reincarnation, and rainbow bodies are retrofits, philosophical overlays imported long after the fact from traditions having no connection to Jesus' own life and teachings. Still, Dale is perfectly right when he reminds us that our worldview influences the conclusions we reach. Once again, he writes, "My judgment is that the historical evidence, even when combined with these additional considerations, that is, belief in an afterlife, assent to some metanormal events, and a divinity of some sort, does not demand the Orthodox Christian verdict." Agreed. The evidence for Jesus' resurrection to life alone does not demand the verdict that the God of Israel raised Jesus. However, it's difficult to deny that it's truly suggestive. The question then is not whether the evidence demands a verdict that absolutely excludes every rival, but whether it warrants a verdict that one explanation is more probable than its competitors. On that ordinary historical standard, the resurrection hypothesis performs well. This circles us back to Dale's historiographical standard. Has he set the burden of proof too high? Near the book's close, he asserts, "There are, as I have emphasized throughout these pages, no incontrovertible, synonymical arguments that sweep all before their path. It is not manifest that God raised Jesus from the dead is, if one is trying to call a fair race, the clear winner going away with the best skeptical competition a furlong behind. The data constrain us by limiting possibilities, not by excluding all possibilities save one." Bracketing agency for a moment, Allison is correct. We do not possess synonymical arguments that obliterate every rival. But most historians do not insist on synonymies, only on evidence that tip the scales beyond more probable than not. By that ordinary standard, the evidence justifies the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead, even if it leaves a few rivals severely wounded on the battlefield instead of delivering death blows to them. Once we move beyond the limits of historical method to the question of agency, it's reasonable to infer, given what we know of the life and teachings of Jesus, that it was the God of Israel who raised him from the dead. That judgment cannot be certified by historical tools alone, but it's a warranted next step for those willing to integrate historical findings with philosophical and theological considerations. Conclusion. Dale's book succeeds in its goal, probing the limits of historical criticism. It's thoughtful, challenging, and clearly the work of a premier scholar grappling with big questions. Although I part company with Dale on a number of items in his book, I'm grateful for the way he has challenged my thinking, perhaps more than anyone else writing on the subject today.